No, just welcome Alison Stranger. So Alison is new to SFI, relatively new to SFI, so some of you won't know her. But really this issue that hasn't been raised yet of this optimism around the use of data to perhaps transform social sciences also comes with a cost, and perhaps you'll address some of those issues.
Yes, I will.
And so we're much looking forward to your talk. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks so much. So this is showing the time now, correct?
Yes, it should.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm currently out and about doing all sorts of public speaking about my current book on whistleblowers, which is out there, which was released on the same day as Nancy Pelosi announced the impeachment investigation. So it's a real great break to test drive some ideas from my next project on you here today. And I think it's going to follow very nicely from the first presentation. It will almost look like we planned it, perhaps. So what I would like to do is put forward a frame, a new frame here. And that's this. Liberal democracy is a complex adaptive system under global siege. I'm going to try to bring politics and governance back into our discussion. And I want to illuminate this dynamic from a multiplicity of angles, from the vantage point of the United States, of the European Union, of the business-government relationship in a global economy. I'm going to focus on that line between business and government in the global economy that has become increasingly porous and has made some of the challenges more difficult. Here's a roadmap for what I want to do. I suppose I could flash this on the screen and give you, because that's not the title of my talk, but we'll work with that. What I want to do very briefly is 5 things. I want to first ask, is justice a function of regime type? And I'm going to argue that it is. And this is going to make justice, the whole very notion of justice, more complex in a global economy. Second, we'll look at the increasingly porous line between business and government, which is a product of both privatization and of globalization. And these have combined to hollow out government. I wrote a previous book called One Nation Under Contract, which was about the privatization of all these functions in national security that really changed the way people think about what government is and those things that only government can do well. So I think Barney Frank got it right when he said that government is just another word for the things we do together. Third, I want to look at some of the implications of statistical machine learning algorithms and privatized government in a global economy, and suggest to you that they are resulting in more social inequality. Fourth, I'll take up some of the Enlightenment's blind spots, and we'll talk about Pinker a bit. And finally, I want to leave you with some thoughts about liberal democratic citizenship in a big data world. Now, each of these could be a talk in of itself, but I want to just throw them out there for you. You can consider this a symphonic effort to generate discussion. So I hope we'll have a good discussion. So why is justice a function of regime type? Well, surveillance in the internet age, whether by governments or companies, often relies on algorithmic searches of big data. Statistical machine learning algorithms are group-based. Liberal democracy, in contrast, is rights-based. It's individual-based, in that it is individuals whose rights are the chief focus of constitutional protection. Algorithmic opacity, which can be the product of trade secrets, expert specialization, or probabilistic design, poses additional challenges for self-government because it by definition abstracts away the individual on which a rights-based regime depends. So some challenges for liberal democracy. In contrast, in illiberal regimes, the distinction between the public and the private spheres is not drawn in the same way, and the individual is not the regime's point of departure. So privacy is routinely sacrificed at the altar of national security and societal goals in authoritarian systems. For example, China's Google, Baidu, has partnered with the military in the China Brain Project. It involves running deep learning algorithms over the data Baidu collects about its users. And according to an account in Scientific American, every Chinese citizen is receiving a so-called citizen score, which will be used to determine who gets scarce resources such as jobs, loans, or even travel visas. China also uses facial recognition currently to monitor its Uyghur Muslim minority for law enforcement purposes. China's social credit system is designed to reward pro-social behavior and punish so-called anti-social behavior. That is now operational. So, in The Human Condition, which is a book that Hannah Arendt wrote in 1958, she lamented the absurd idea of establishing morals as an exact science by focusing on things that are easily measurable or quantifiable. For Arendt, the question is, quote, not whether we are the masters or slaves of our machines, but whether machines still serve the world and its things, or if, on the contrary, they and the automatic motion of their processes have begun to rule and even destroy world and things. So the widening digital age conflict between producers and consumers and citizens reflects a heightened tension between market values and liberal democratic Republican values. And this is important because when you look at, what is going to be appropriate or ethical or advance progress, and you're going to abstract away governance, abstract away the type of political regime you're trying to maintain, I think you're going to reach some flawed conclusions. That's easy to do because capitalism and democracy developed contemporaneously and symbiotically. So it's easy to miss this potential divergence between entrepreneurship and human values for reasons that were outlined in the last presentation quite nicely. So in the Chinese context, deploying citizen scores, deploying racial profiling in utilitarian fashion may be legitimate, but in a rights-based liberal democracy, such algorithmic discrimination must be illegitimate. You might say that bell curves don't matter for human rights. Individuals do. So justice, I think we really cannot divorce it from the political order we're trying to maintain. And I think we all agree that liberal democracy probably optimizes human flourishing. Maybe there's some people who disagree with that, but I would say that's the case. So what's happened to the business-government relationship? Or has the business of government become business? You can see this kind of conflict quite nicely in the March 2016 standoff between Apple and the FBI. Does anybody remember that? Where the Apple refused to help the government unlock the iPhone of Saeed Farouk, who was charged with killing 14 in the December 2nd, 2015 San Bernardino terrorist attack. Since Apple's market is global, it had no interest in complying with the FBI's request, as its foreign customers are unlikely to pay a premium for a smartphone that the US government can access. Yet Apple is also a company headquartered in the United States, and American citizens have an obvious interest in preventing future terrorist attacks. So this is a friction between the profit motive and national interest, and you can see it as well in the decisions of Facebook's senior leadership to downplay Russian interference in the 2016 elections until a free press forced them to own their very self-interested choices. I don't know if you remember this, but Facebook adopted a three-pronged optics strategy for that. They first pursued an aggressive lobbying campaign in Washington to shift public anger onto Facebook's rival companies and thwart regulation that could undercut Facebook's market share. Second, they tapped business relationships to frame criticism of Facebook's leadership, all Jewish, Zuckerberg, Sandberg, and Kaplan. They suggested that was anti-Semitic. But finally, and perhaps most alarmingly, Facebook employed a Republican opposition research firm called Definers Public Affairs to discredit its critics by linking them to the liberal financier George Soros. This prompted a November 14, 2018 letter from the president of the Open Society Foundations, that's Soros' philanthropic arm. And I just wanted to read a bit from you here so you can get a sense of this tension. This is from Gaspard, the president of the OSF. Dear Ms. Sandberg, I was shocked to learn from the New York Times that you and your colleagues at Facebook hired a Republican opposition research firm to stir up animus toward George Soros. As you know, there is a concerted right-wing effort the world over to demonize Mr. Soros and his foundations, which I lead. And this is an effort which has contributed to death threats and the delivery of a pipe bomb to Mr. Soros' home. You are no doubt also aware that much of this hateful and blatantly false and anti-Semitic information is spread via Facebook. The notion that your company, at your direction, actively engaged in the same behavior to try to discredit people exercising their First Amendment rights to protect Facebook's role in disseminating vile propaganda is frankly astonishing to me. These efforts appear to have been part of a deliberate strategy to distract from the very real accountability problems your company continues to grapple with. This is reprehensible and an offense to the core values open society seeks to advance. But at bottom, this is not about George Soros or your foundations. Your methods threaten the very values underpinning our democracy. So what was Facebook thinking? Well, they worried that if Facebook implicated Russia still further, Republicans would accuse Facebook of siding with Democrats. And they were also concerned that if they pulled down the Russians' fake pages, those who had been deceived by these ads would be outraged. The one thing they clearly were not thinking about was what was best for American citizens, American democracy, and the rule of law. To get a better sense of the magnitude of this problem, Facebook announced in May 2019 that it had deleted more than 3 billion fake accounts. A number roughly, 13 billion fake accounts, a number roughly comparable to the combined 2018 populations of the US, China, and India. So this global nature of the ad market for Google and Facebook represents the greatest challenge for American electoral integrity. It's embedded in the very business model. It's not a bug of the model, it's a feature. So looking to the future, the prospect of an alliance between authoritarian states and large IT monopolies that would effectively merge corporate and state surveillance, and George Soros has warned about this, could facilitate totalitarian control unlike anything the world has previously seen. This is something that's very interesting because remember, Silicon Valley's firms at first sold themselves to the public as promoters of ideals rather than as profit-seeking companies. Until very recently, Google's mantra was "don't be evil." And Facebook still defines its mission as to make the world more open and connected. Apple recently rebranded its retail outlets as town squares. So this sincere newspeak makes it easier for consumers unthinkingly to trade their personal data for continued free use of the platform. But this may not continue. What you're really seeing is a real friction between what we want as consumers and what we need as citizens. And I'll say a bit more about that. Where does social inequality figure into this? How does it relate to social inequality in a big data world? Well, to see the trade-offs more clearly, it's helpful to return to Hannah Arendt and think about two models of man: bourgeois man and citizen man. For Marx and his heirs, the class struggle between bourgeois man and working man, between the oppressor and the oppressed, is the central dynamic. But Montesquieu, Machiavelli, Montaigne, and the American founders, however, ransacked the archives of antiquity, as Arendt puts it, to imagine a different model of man for the new republic. And the model man of this new system, which built on the Roman conception of the public sphere, was the citizen of the Athenian polis. The American Constitution's architects thus drew on both Greece and Rome in imagining the new republic of the United States. In this vision, inclusive citizen engagement in American political life is essential for both self-government and human flourishing. Now, here's the fact, though. That original vision excluded blacks and women from citizenship. But it's equally true that the same values evolved over time to include all humans of voting age. When it inadvertently reinforces inequality, statistical machine learning's focus on efficiency will pose problems for liberal democracy. But there's a competing claim that statistical machine learning can reinforce consistency by identifying bias. I think this is a really fascinating area for empirical research. Put another way, if injustice tends to be group-based, we see inequality aligned along group lines. Does that mean we need to address injustice by focusing on groups? Or is it instead the case that race-based data collection will simply reproduce and reify racism on a grander scale? What seems clear to me is that the idea that free markets are the solution to all challenges of public life is no longer tenable. Whenever the people allow companies to pursue profit maximization relentlessly in a global market without attention to consequences, producers are unwittingly elevated over citizens. And along personal lines, whenever citizens allow their personal data to be harvested in exchange for a better deal, consumers are inadvertently elevated over citizens. Yet we need citizens in a democracy. So we mentioned Steve Pinker earlier. I want to talk about the Enlightenment's blind spot here quickly and then conclude. There's a dark side to this big data world that I think I've tried to share with you. It's a world where the public and private spheres no longer have clear lines of demarcation, which has prompted Steven Pinker to call for a revival of Enlightenment values, both humanist and scientific, to reinvigorate public life and democratic deliberation. Pinker defines such humanism as the call for maximizing human flourishing. Yet the Enlightenment's association with slavery, colonialism, and domination caused others to see the Enlightenment as the problem. If you followed memes, you see the OK Boomer meme, that's a good example of that. If our aim is reform that enables human flourishing, the key question to ask is who is doing the lion's share of the flourishing in the existing system? With spiraling racial inequality in the United States, economic inequality along racial lines in the United States, the question can no longer go unasked. If we do not acknowledge Enlightenment's abuses, those who are suspicious of the Enlightenment's hypocrisy are unlikely to see moral questions in the same way. And here I just want to look back on the efforts of once well-respected scientists in the 19th century, enamored of Darwin, such as Charles Peirce and Louis Agassiz, who believed, as Silicon Valley seems to do today, that being able to measure something was synonymous with understanding it. Entirely unaware of the influence of their own self-interest and biases on the questions they found interesting, they developed polygenism, the idea that the races were different right from the start as opposed to being that way from genetic degeneration. And they did this to explain the racial inequality they observed, which was a nice way of seeing the institution of slavery as a legitimate response to natural inequality. So this problem of self-interested reasoning was not exclusive to racial fantasy in the United States. Aristotle's polis in Athens, that I spoke of earlier, was the preserve of property owners only. German Kultur birthed spectacular art, music, and philosophy, as well as Nazism. So reviewing the Enlightenment's abuses and its triumphs demonstrates the necessity, as Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer urged in Dialectics of Enlightenment, for the Enlightenment's champions to engage in a bit of critical self-reflection and historical honesty in proposing remedies for the ethical dilemmas humans face. So what I'm really saying here is that human beings, all of us, this is not just some of us, have blind spots that need to be owned if we are to confront contemporary inequality in America with requisite force. And for that, we need reason and free inquiry, not militant ideology. The best way to right wrongs, advised Ida B. Wells, is to turn the light of truth on them. So where does this leave us with liberal democratic citizenship in a big data world? If we take Wells' admonition to heart, what is happening to democracy when foreign purchase ads can swing an American election? Money can amplify a message in social media. And to date, Facebook has shown no interest in whether the money is foreign or American. Facebook's tools of micro-targeting, its machine learning, and its paid promotions are all utterly opaque, and they have unwittingly worked in tandem with the Trump White House to elevate lies over truth and wealth over American citizenship. I think we need to, engineers and corporate leadership alike need to be mindful of this decoupling of profits and profit margins from the common good. All Western computer scientists should care about the consumers versus citizens tension, not only because as citizens they value liberal democracy, but also because the long-term sustainability of the companies for which they work depends on it. When platforms or products appear to undermine human values, brands are tarnished in the free world, sometimes irreparably. The challenge will be to reclaim the public sphere for the people and democratic deliberation rather than as a locus of self-promotion and manipulation. And a necessary condition for meeting that challenge will be to reintroduce political thought, reintroduce thinking about the role of government to scientific knowledge. Politics has no place in scientific research, yet we know standing in the shadow of Los Alamos that ideas can be weaponized. When technological innovation outstrips the capacity of existing norms and laws, it will take more than science to construct safeguards for human development and reharness science to the public interest. The thing to remember here, and that I think we've forgotten, is that there are some things that only government can do well. Or let me just put it really simply here. Nobody elected or appointed Silicon Valley. So, put another way, the sustainability of liberal democracy requires all of us to be citizens first and consumers second. And I think scientists who understand the inherent trade-offs between what we want as consumers or producers and what we need as citizens can be critical allies rather than enemies of pluralism and the freedom of the individual. So I will stop there. I can say a lot more about all of those topics. That was really rapid, but I've just run through my 20 minutes, and I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. So please, on any of that. Thank you for your attention. You can ask questions about whistleblowers, too, if you like. Yes?
Hi. I really liked your raising of the OK Boomer meme, and I just wanted you to perhaps talk a little bit about the rise of the, and I wouldn't necessarily call them marginal, but newly empowered constituencies. For example, the OK Boomer, #MeToo, the rise of feminism in public discourse, and what are your thoughts about that, and what role will those play in creating our new society?
Well, you put your finger on an important point, and you saw the memes for the last presentation as well. It's important to realize that memes aren't arguments. Memes aren't ideas. I get very worried when memes are driving our politics. That's, if you want to have engaged citizenship, it's not going to involve memes. It's going to involve arguments and public discussion. So I don't like the memes. Now, what you're seeing, though, I really think is a push, and you see it with the OK Boomer. That's what the OK Boomer meme signifies. For all of us boomers who have created the mess we're currently in, to acknowledge certain truths that have gone unacknowledged. And that's why I raised the point about the Enlightenment's blind spots and some of the crazy science that took place. I mean, Agassi and Pierce were at Harvard. They were at the top of their game, and that they were really espousing racist theories. And I think that's just because all of us really possess blind spots. We're viewing things through our own lens, and the way to combat that, in my view, is to own the history. Not the distorted ideological version of history, but these truths, as someone like Jill Lepore would define them. And that means you've just got to see that the history of the United States, I wouldn't go as far as the 1619 Project with the New York Times, which, are you familiar with the 1619 Project? Yeah, that's really interesting because it's saying that the American founding is really 1619 with slavery in America, not these glorious ideals that the founders put before us. I think that's really flawed and distorting in many respects because the ideals aren't the problem. It's the implementation, the hypocritical implementation of the ideals, and hopefully we progress to own those ideals in their totality. But what's happening with the OK Boomer meme is you see young people saying, why should we even listen to you? Don't tell me about the glories of American democracy because, you're destroying the planet. And you committed genocide with Native Americans, and you enslaved black Americans, and you didn't give women the right to vote until the 20th century. All of those things are true, and I think they need to be owned in order for people to appreciate what we have in the Western world. But and this is what's so frightening about the move towards STEM fields. I love STEM. I love being in Santa Fe and discussing these problems. What's frightening to me about that interest is that it's this complete truncated understanding of human development. There's no comparative perspective. There's no historical perspective. That's what enables young people to look around at what's going on in the United States and say, hashtag burn it down. If they understood how it compared historically to other political systems, or what it looked like compared to, say, China, other regimes around the world, they'd see it very differently. But you can't have that without historical and comparative knowledge. So that's why there are truths that aren't revealed through measurement, but only through careful study and understanding of politics in time, which is what I think we need to do to own the Enlightenment's blind spots. I hope that gives you, yeah. Yeah.
Can you ask people to give their name as well? So
Sure. Of course, yes. State your name, please.
Jim Rutt, just a comment or announcement. The OK Boomer meme had annoyed the hell out of me, so yesterday I launched a counter meme.
Yeah?
Hashtag Boomer Pride. And it's going exponential. As of a couple hours ago, it had a couple 100,000 shots. And so all you boomers that are tired of OK Boomer, every time you see it, go hashtag Boomer Pride.
You know the only problem with that, though, are the unintended consequences. That felt good, right?
Arms race. Remember,
Yeah,
everything
yeah,
is an arms
yeah.
race. Always has been, always will be. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm very tired of the meme hashtag.
I'm even sorry I brought it up, because all the questions have been on the meme, but you can capture some of the dissatisfaction and discontent in the public today. That is very real. Yes.
I'm Melanie Mitchell. You mentioned something about the need to rethink the role of government in science. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that and what the trade-offs are?
Yeah, I was looking at the clock, so I raced forward on that. It's a good question. I think the thing that's important to realize, and it's something that has been blurred by this belief that market solutions are always superior if you can have them. I mean, that's the mantra. It's a Republican and Democratic mantra in Washington, that if you get a market solution and contract out for something, it's going to produce a better outcome. But what that's done over time is erode a sense of those things that only government can do well. Because I love the private sector. I love free markets. We want companies out there pursuing, a healthy bottom line. But at the same time, if we're interested in the common good, that kind of dynamic is not going to get us there. You really need government to uphold the common good. But because this line has become so porous, and I think we can even see this represented in Donald Trump, people no longer are aware of the importance of government. And so what you see is a developing tendency in Silicon Valley that they're not only going to take care of, they're going to, in a sense, bypass government or replace government. So Facebook, for example, announced it was going to have some kind of internal judging system for evaluating, First Amendment rights. Well, we have a judicial system to do that. And there's just an enormous conflict of interest there. The same, I'm getting to your question about scientific research. The same applies to scientific research. I mean, there's a real need for government funding of scientific research precisely for this reason. It's not that you can't take money from a variety of sources and still be independent and deliver interesting scientific findings without being swayed by the funding sources. But government in the past has played a critical role in scientific development. And I see a movement increasingly that disturbs me in thinking that government itself is the problem. And this is not only true for science, but it's true for education. And you just see the hollowing out of government and the loss of any sense of what the public interest actually is. And I think part of what's before us today is reclaiming that notion of the public interest, of the common good, and devising solutions that keep that in mind and keep government at the table in some of these discussions, say on artificial intelligence, for example. And you've written about this, so maybe you have some thoughts.
I have not right this minute, but
Yeah.
no, but I think I see what you're saying. I think you may be a little over-romanticizing government as being in the public interest.
No, not at all. No, if you read
but
my last
over
book,
the
you'll see.
course of science, at least in the last century, we've seen a lot of science being driven by military prerogatives, sort of what the military wants, that part of the government. And that's really affected science very deeply in good and bad ways. And it's not clear that that's the kind of government sort of push on science that you're talking about.
Yeah,
But
no, I think that's a fair point. We have the internet because of DARPA, so maybe there are alternative models to talk about, but I think the government funding is extraordinarily important. Yes?
Farhan Mustafa. One of the first question you posed was the global system being under a global siege, but a lot of the things you are outlining are quite particular to the U.S.
That's correct.
Even the global companies you're talking about, the opposition they're facing in other countries are actually largely governmental. So what is it particularly about the American society that the liberal democracy is taking this, if you were to call it a left turn, whereas other liberal democracies are at different stages of this spectrum? It's tough to generalize about all these different liberal democracies in one statement.
That's right.
But this discussion is particularly, I think, fairly American-centric. So can you maybe offer a few comments on why you think that is, and what does the global scene look like for liberal democracy?
That's an excellent question. You're right. I was making it American-centric because I was making an argument about justice being meaningful within a particular political system when I made the comparison with China and the United States. But you're right. Obviously, there are other liberal democracies. There are allies. And I also mentioned this global siege of liberal democracy. And that's very real. I mean, if you look at what's happening with the Trump White House today, that is very much a case of what I would call rule of law capitalism versus crony capitalism. The president's allies are oligarchs. And if you're interested in human flourishing, if you're interested in continuing to have entrepreneurship, and you're going to want rule of law capitalism for small business as well, not crony capitalism. So what you're really seeing is and you see this with the whistleblower protection that I've studied in my last book. This current crisis in Washington is brought about by a whistleblower from the intelligence community. The European Union has recently passed expansive whistleblower protection legislation, which make it very possible that you could see additional information coming from Europe on some of these financial flows that could affect Trump's position in the United States and the impeachment proceedings. So what I really do see is a global struggle between rule of law, liberal democracy, and illiberal regimes that are often run by oligarchs and crony capitalism. And the thing that I'm worried about is maybe we're just going to throw out the Bill of Rights. I mean, maybe we're no longer going to care about democracy in the United States so long as people who have extraordinary wealth and power keep that wealth and power. So there is this problem with the the people at the top of the economic hierarchy have a vested interest in the status quo continuing, but it's on a track to something that looks very undemocratic to me, and that has all kinds of consequences for inequality in the system, which is only likely to grow if we don't reinforce the rule of law. The rule of law basically says that the leaders don't get to tell you what the truth is. You have an independent judiciary, you can appeal to that judiciary, you're equal before the law, and a lot of other good things follow from that. There are a lot of other ways to order political societies that could be congruent with wealth and people keeping their fortunes. But I don't think they're, and maybe if we're interested in not pursuing growth at the exclusion of all other values, maybe that would slow things down a little bit. That could have positive environmental consequences, but it's certainly not a situation in which science is going to flourish or freedom of thought and expression. It's not a regime I would want to live in. So there really is a global struggle here, and it has everything to do with politics and governance. And if you leave that out of the economic equation, I think you're going to miss some really important things you need to get us where we need to go, as was presented in the first fabulous presentation. But that's a great question. Thank you for it. Other questions?
Great. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.